Okay, so it looks like everybody can hear me now. Uh, so once again, my name is Dr. Álvaro Huerta, and I'm really happy to be here with everybody. I would like to thank the librarian and everybody from the library, Chris, for putting this together. And then also I'd like to thank everybody who's joining us. Some of you didn't have a choice because you're my students. So you're gonna have to bear with us. But for those of you who are not, I really appreciate your participation. Actually, I appreciate the students too, because they need to get an A in the class. And they know the rules. Just laugh at my jokes and you'll get an A. So today we're discussing something that is very a difficult topic to discuss when we're looking at violence and race and migration. But I'm gonna try to keep it somewhat of a balance so that we can have a discussion over this. Now, the presentation is something that it's a little bit a lot of slides, so I'm just going to go through them rather quickly, and then once I end, it'll probably be about an hour. Then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. Now, even though people, just a little bit about me before I start. So I was born in the United States in Sacramento. I say Sacramento when because I got my PhD. So before I used to say Sacramento before the PhD, but I just joke. But I was raised in Tijuana for 4 years. According to the racist, I'm an anchor baby because my mother, on purpose, had me here. Well, I was conceived in Tijuana, but she didn't have a work permit. She had a passport, and so with her passport, she was able to work in San Diego and then deliver me in Sacramento, in Northern California. So I was raised 10 years in East LA, Ramona Gardens housing projects, also known as Big Hazard. So I experienced violence, poverty, police abuse, and hopelessness, growing up. I'm a first generation. Raise your hand, even though I can't see you, but I want everybody to raise their hand if they're also first generation university students. So you could just do the physical or the virtual raising your hand. So in my case, I'm a first generation elementary school, high school, university graduate. I started at Upper Bound at Occidental College. It's a program for youth that are historically disadvantaged. I lived on campus for 2 summers when I was 15 and 16 at Occidental College, where Obama attended for 2 years. And then at 17, I started UCLA as a math major. I was a child prodigy when it came to math. But when it came to reading and writing, I wasn't prepared for the university. Eventually, I ended up teaching myself how to read and write and finishing as a history major. I then pursued a master's in urban planning at UCLA, and then a PhD at UC Berkeley in city and regional planning. Currently, I'm a Chicano scholar activist at Cal Poly Pomona. One of my mentors, I really don't believe in mentors given my age and everything that I accomplished, but if I were to have a mentor, it would be Dr. Juan Gomez Quiñones. He was one of my professors at UCLA in the mid 80s. He wrote this brilliant essay on anti-Mexicanism. And he writes that anti-Mexicanism is a form of nativism, practiced by colonists and their inheritors. This is pretty much the framework of what I talk about throughout this presentation. When we think about the other, people have talked about this term a lot, but a lot of people don't know what it means. So what does it mean when someone says the other or to be otherized? It has to do with this idea that for racialized communities, Black, Brown, Native American, Asian, Pacific Islanders, and so on and so forth, have been treated in this country as if they don't belong. as if they're different. So it's this us versus them. There was a professor, he passed away now, at Harvard, Huntington, Samuel Huntington, and this small-minded individual, argued that Europeans were superior to Mexicans, or white Americans were superior to Mexicans, because white people come from Europe and Mexicans, from Mexico. And he wrote this article in Foreign Affairs. It's called the Hispanic Challenge, or the Hispanic Threat, or something of that nature. Pretty much scapegoated Mexicans even before Trump did, and others. And arguing that because of the European is Anglo, he is superior to the Mexican in this case, because the Mexican is indigenous. And the European, in this case, the Anglo, speaking about Anglos, is Christian, and versus the Mexican who's Catholic. So he produced this very non-intellectual article arguing this us versus them. So it's not that when we talk about the other, whether it's black or brown people or others, it's not that we're just different, but it's we're less than. I wasn't a big supporter of Obama because of his policies against immigrants, where he deported 2.7 million immigrants. But I was not happy with the fact that Trump and others were targeting Obama because of the color of his skin, because he didn't belong. So therefore, he must be from Kenya, or he must have cheated. He didn't get into Occidental College. He didn't get into Columbia or Harvard Law. He must. Let's see his transcripts. So this idea that you're different, but you're less than, is something that we need to fight against. So this article this PowerPoint presentation focuses a lot on the case of Mexicans as an example, as a case study. So it doesn't imply that others didn't experience this, but this is the area where I study and where I'm most familiar with. And also this is the people that I come from. After slavery, we see a lot of signs where during Jim Crow, for example, where blacks, African Americans could not go to certain restaurants, they could not get on the bus, and if they did, they had to go on the back of the bus, or they couldn't drink from the same fountain. And what a lot of people don't know is that a lot of these same policies applied to Mexicans. So there were actually signs in the Southwest where it was white only. If you were Mexican, you couldn't enter the restaurant or the movie theater. And if there was a public pool, Mexicans could only swim in it on Wednesdays when they were going to clean it. So we see a lot of this racism taking place throughout America, or North America, not only against African Americans, but also Mexicans. And we see this the case also of Chinese, Japanese, when they were put in camps. The case of Chinese, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1800s, I think it was 1882, and also against Jewish people, where they were being discriminated against as well. There were some other slides that I didn't want to include because of the nature, they're just too graphic, where after the United States invaded Mexico and took half of their territory, we see that Mexicans were being lynched as well in the thousands during the mid to the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And there's some two great books that were produced on this topic. So we all know about abuse, we all know about violence, but we all have to recognize that verbal abuse is also a form of violence. So when Trump talked about drug dealers, that Mexicans were drug dealers, for me, it wasn't just an academic problem or a public policy problem, but it's also a personal problem because my father's a Mexican. So when he talked about the Mexicans in this way, he's talking about my people. He's talking about my father, my mother. And this is a watercolor that my brother Salomon Huerta did. Is where you can see he's a good-looking guy, uh, handsome man. He looks like somebody I know. But this idea of labeling people, generalizing them as a group, that them being drug dealers, criminals. This is a painting of my mother, Carmen Huerta. They both passed away now. It's a beautiful painting, oil painting. But this language to generalize about a people, we see this similar to what the Nazis did against the Jewish people, where they were categorized as this threat, just like Samuel Huntington, wrote about Mexicans, that they're a threat to society. So we have to be careful. So it's another way of scaring, in this case, white people against black people, against brown people, against people coming from the southern border, that they're criminals, that they're drug dealers, that they're rapists. So this language is nothing new in terms of the case of African Americans. We all know this exists to the present, but we know little of the same language being used against the case of Mexicans and also Central Americans and others. We see now this similar racist language against Asian Americans, Chinese Americans with the coronavirus, in the way that Trump and his ilk talk about our people and people of color. For me, once again, this is everything I do is not only professional, but it's also personal because I experienced it, being a Chicano, being a Mexican, being of Mexican origin. So when I went to a junior high school in the 7th grade, I got bused to an all-white school, among Gleason Junior High. And the first thing that the white kids did when we got there, because they saw us as a threat, it was kind of like Birmingham, Alabama, when they started throwing rocks at the black kids that wanted to integrate the school. They started calling us names like wetback, lowrider, beaner. And then coming from the hood, coming from the barrio, I didn't even know that these were insults because everybody in my community, we were all Mexican, we were all poor. So I didn't even know. I mean, I knew the derogatory term wetback, but I didn't know lowriders and beaners was an insult. So even when they would call me that, I thought, don't you eat beans too? Like I didn't even know it was an insult. But for the first time in my life, when I was in 7th grade, I realized that I was different, and in some places I didn't belong. So for the physical, the throwing the rocks at our bus and trying to intimidate us didn't really scare me. It was more of a shock, the verbal. But growing up on the mean streets of East Los Angeles, I learned what violence is. And I blame the people in charge, those in charge of HUD, the Housing Authority, to produce neighborhoods where there's a lot of dysfunction, a lot of violence, a lot of poverty, a lot of police abuse, and things of that nature. So in the early 1970s, my family moved from Tijuana to Hollywood and then to East LA into public housing projects, Ramona Gardens housing projects, also known as Big Hazard. And this is a mural of driving into the driveway where we first entered our apartment, and you just see the violence already. This is the first thing that we see moving in. So Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, he talks about this idea of the abyss, and when you stare too long or into the abyss, when you gaze into the abyss for too long, it'll gaze back into you. And this is what happens, when you grow up in these type of neighborhoods, these barrios and ghettos, where high concentration of poverty, high concentration of neglect from the government. We have gangs, we have drugs, we have violence, and a lot of that violence comes actually from the police itself. There's a painting that my brother did of these two the homeboy and homegirl that actually are neighbors. And there's a lot of misconception about gangs. It's not true that the gangs terrorize the neighborhood. If you weren't part of the gang, that they didn't bother you. And for us, or at least myself, just speaking only for myself, we grew up. I grew up with them. So by the time my friends got into the gang, they knew who I was, so they didn't pick on me, they didn't bother me. It was just we went two different directions. I went into sports and school, and they went into gangs. Um, there's two life-size portraits that my brother did, and on to humanize, and not looking at gang members as gang members, but as human beings, and trying to portray them in a beautiful way, um, where they're at the end of the day they're victims of their environment, and we need to look at it that way. I'm a big supporter of Homeboy Industries and Father Boyle, where he talks about kinship, and he also talks about giving people second chance, third chance, and providing them with opportunities. Every time I'm somewhere, whether at UCLA or Berkeley or at Cal Poly now, people ask me, "Oh, why didn't you join a gang, Alvaro? Like, how did you make it? Why did you join a gang?" And I usually say the same thing. Is I joke about it. I said, "Well, I did submit my application, to join the gang, but it got rejected because I was too skinny. I couldn't defend the hood." There's another painting by my brother Salomon Huerta. He's a world famous artist. I went to Pasadena City College, then he transferred into Art Center in Pasadena, the best design school in the world. And this shows, the homeboys, killing pigs. In this case, the pig symbolizing the police. So when you grow up in this type of environment and the police harass you, whether you're in a gang or not, they treat you like you are. So you don't have any trust with them. They're more like an occupation force. It's not, any encounter is negative. It's not like, what can I do for you? How can I serve you? So we see this in Ferguson. We see this in Minneapolis and others in the case of African Americans. Now, when I was 16 years old, and I was learning how to drive, a cop pulled me over. I was teaching myself how to drive. My sister gave me a 67 Mustang, and I did a rolling stop, and then the sirens were behind me, but I didn't really know what that meant, so I just kept driving. And then by the time they pulled me over, they pulled a gun at me. They pointed it to my face, and I just got out, and I told them, I was just learning how to drive. I don't know why they were harassing me, and they let me go. But this was very common. Every day, somebody would get a gun pulled on them. So even my mother, back then there was no internet or anything like that, no cell phones or anything. So even my mother, when she found out what happened through the Comadre network, she asked me, "¿Qué pasó, mijo?" I said, "No, just la policía." He goes, "Okay, mijo. ¿Tienes hambre?" She would always say that. "¿Tienes hambre?" I go, "Sí, ma." He goes, "Okay, tengo frijoles." So I ate some beans. But, to be honest, there's another painting by my brother. It's a brilliant painting. It's a recent painting. He has a series of guns, and this gun is not pro-violence. This is my father's gun. To be honest, there was an incident where this is pretty much the first time I've talked about this in public, but there was an incident where an older gang member wanted to, beat up my father because my father picked on one of his kids. He didn't do it on purpose because the kid was picking on my brother, Noel. And so my father, pulled the kid up and then pushed him to the ground because he was on top of my younger brother in terms of beating him up. And then later they were looking for my father. I was 13 years old. So my father gave me his gun, and I was like his backup. And I was only 13 years old. And my father approached the homeboys and said, "Hey man, there's no problem. I didn't do it on purpose. He was picking on my son." And then the homeboys respected my father because he didn't go to the cops, and he didn't report them or anything like that. And so after going home back to the house, we just watched TV, and I gave him his gun back. And then I thought to myself, I mean, what kind of life is this? Like, my father should be taking me to little league games or anything like that. But here he is, I'm his backup. But fortunately, nothing happened. But if something would have happened, I wouldn't be having this PowerPoint presentation. So just a few slides on cases of anti-Mexicanism. It's just a brief history, nothing extensive, but you'll get the idea of what I'm getting at. There's a lot of talk, or there's been a lot of talk, not just Trump, but presidents before him, that Mexicans are invaders, and we see this case with the caravans, that Central Americans are invaders. The caravan that took place for about 3-4 years ago, they're invading our country, they're a threat. But the real invaders are the Yankees. First, they took Texas in 1836, and then the rest of the Southwest in 1848. I mean, one of the problems that the Mexicans have, that my people have, is we're too kind and we're too generous. And when we said, mi casa es tu casa, they took our casa. So the invaders are the ones that have taken our land and have occupied our land. So when we have Mexicans here in the United States, we don't feel, or I don't feel, that we're illegal or we're aliens or we're invaders, because we were here first. We've been here for thousands of years, even before these incidents took place. Just a few slides on anti-Mexicanism. We see the case in the 1920s and 30s of a mass deportation. Over 2 million Mexicans were deported during the Great Depression, 60% of them being citizens or legal citizens, residents. And back then it wasn't really a big deal with the border or ICE. There was no ICE, it was INS, but it wasn't even established like it is now. But to make room for whites so they can have jobs due to the Great Depression, where unemployment was probably 40-50%, a little bit bigger than what it is now, or a lot bigger. The Mexicans were scapegoated and sent back to home, to their motherland, or their other motherland, because this is our motherland too. But during World War II, we see the hypocrisy of the United States, where after deporting 2 million, where millions of Americans, also Mexican Americans, but white Americans, Black Americans, were serving in the war to fight Nazism, to fight Hitler and other fascist regimes in Spain, Japan, Italy. The Mexican government had a contract or an agreement with the United States, a guest worker program called the Bracero program, where over 4.6 million Mexicans were recruited to work in the fields. And they also did construction and helped build railroads. Now we see here 2 pictures, one of them Mexicans being sprayed with DDT. Now DDT causes cancer, and they're literally sprayed them with it. Now for me, once again, this is personal. This is my father was a bracero. He got sprayed with DDT, so did my grandfather, my uncles, and they lived in these awful conditions, as you can see on your right. And there's a brilliant photographer, Leonard Nato, who documented this history. So in bad times, they deport the Mexicans. This is another contradiction of America. But after the war, the United States experienced an economic boom, because war is business. And while Europe was devastated, the United States was not, because the war took place in Europe. So we see after World War II, freeways being built, universities being built. We see economic growth. We see urban renewal, where business districts are being built, cities are being reorganized. There's white flight from the city to the suburbs. But even during great economic prosperity, under Eisenhower, Trump's idol, even though he never served in the military due to his so-called injury with his bones or burnt bone spurs, or whatever you call them, I don't see him walking awkwardly. It's a miracle how he got healed, even though he's obese. we see during his campaign, Trump talked about Operation Wetback. You know, he talked about how Eisenhower was his hero. Now, given all of that, what I've said, over 1 million Mexicans were deported again, the majority being citizens. And this is a problem. This is the contradiction of America. So even when Obama or Michelle Obama talk about America being great, or you know, we're losing our way, no, we're not. America was never great. How can you be great during slavery? How can you be great when you're scapegoating people, when you're deporting people? Now, I say this as an American because I was born here. So, and I have a First Amendment right to speak my mind. Like Colonel Kurt says in Apocalypse Now, classic movie, the horror continues. So for brown people, for my people, the horror continues with ICE, deporting, separating families, at schools, in courts, workplaces. There's no place where the undocumented, the hardest working people in the United States, those that make our lives easier, can feel safe because they're being separated and treated as if they're criminals and dehumanized. This is a brilliant illustration by Dr. Alberto Ledesma at UC Berkeley, where for me, how can we sleep comfortably when we have kids in cages? How can we sleep comfortably when brown kids are in these cages and are dehumanized? There's a brilliant philosopher, he passed away now, educator, Paulo Freire, and he talks about dehumanization. He talks about how when a country or the leaders dehumanize a people, in the process of dehumanizing the people, they themselves become dehumanized. So even though Black people are being dehumanized, brown people, Native Americans, and others are being dehumanized under the system that we live in, what those that are doing these acts, what they don't understand, in the process, they themselves are losing their humanity. When I read that, that was deep. I read that a long time ago, and it's never left my mind. So even the oppressor doesn't escape. In the case of the Chicanos and Chicanas, we've always been resisting. Since the day when Hernan Cortés landed in what is now Mexico, Tenochtitlan, I think it was 1519, with his barbaric Spaniard soldiers. The Mexicans, the indigenous, the natives, our people, my people, have always been resisting. We just don't get the same attention in the case of African Americans with the civil rights movement, but we've always been resisting. In 1970, on August 29, 1970, the Chicanos and Chicanas in East LA organized themselves under the banner of the National Chicano Moratorium. So this is not just about, this presentation is not just about us, you know, brown people, racialized people being marginalized or oppressed, but also how we have resisted as well. This is what I was telling my class earlier today, and others, those that I teach, and also my colleagues that they need to be taught too, because they didn't go to Berkeley like I did, is that Chicanos, Chicanas, Mexican people have always been resisting colonization and oppression. It's just that we don't get the same attention. We're not, our struggles are not in the books, in the K-12, in the university. And this is why I strongly fight for ethnic studies, so that our stories are also told in the case of Asian Americans, Filipinos, and others. So on August 29, 1970, between 20, 30,000 Chicanos and Chicanas protested the war in Vietnam. That was their biggest issue. At the time, I need to confirm the statistics, but based on what I've read, Mexican Americans at the time were 5% of the population, but in terms of deaths in Vietnam, we were 20%. So we're disproportionately being sent to war, where the rich, the privileged, those that benefit from white privilege in particular, like Donald Trump, in this case, it's probably orange privilege, were able to get deferments because given their contacts, given that they were wealthy, where a lot of people received deferments because they were at the university. So there was a lot of reasons why rich people or people with privilege were able to get deferments. In other words, not to serve in the war, but that was not the case for Chicanos and Chicanas, for blacks, and even for many poor whites. And these pictures are from Deborah Weber, Dr. Deborah Weber. I wrote an article about this just recently in LA Taco. So make sure y'all check it out. And every time you click it, I get $1. So click it like 10 times. This was a peaceful march, but the police behaved like an occupation force. So the police attacked the peaceful march. There were children and elderly present during this protest and celebration of self-pride. But they went ahead and they brutalized our people. Hundreds were sent to jail. Hundreds were beaten. And this is something that we need to recognize, and we need to document, and we need to discuss so that it doesn't happen again. In particular, about 200 Chicanos and Chicanas were arrested, and the rest, once again, were beaten by the state. In this case, the police, and 3 of them were killed. Of those 3 killed that day, Angel Gilbert Diaz, 35, Lynn Ward, who was African-American, a teen, 15, and the more famous case is Ruben Salazar. He's a LA Times reporter, and he worked at KCET as well. Now, it's a picture of Raul Ruiz, Dr. Raul Ruiz. He passed away recently as well. He was a director of La Raza magazine, and they took a lot of these photographs. Also, Deborah Weber, Dr. Deborah Weber was part of that. So her photographs are included in this presentation as well. And the police, they targeted Ruben Salazar. They fired a projectile that killed him while Ruben Salazar was having a beer at the Silver Dollar in East LA. Here's a painting by a famous painter. He's a veterano. It's a painter from the 70s, 60s, 70s. It's because of people like Frank Romero and others that laid the ground for artists like my brother, Salomon Huerta. It's a brilliant painting by Frank Romero showing the police shooting up the Silver Dollar where Ruben Salazar was at. Now, the thing about Ruben Salazar, he wasn't a radical. This was what's even more distressing, is that he wasn't a radical. He was a moderate. He was a Mexican American. He was within the institution, and they still targeted him. It's not like he was a militant and he had arms and he went to fight against the system and they killed him. No, he was just a middle class reporter, not just, but he was a middle class reporter who was concerned about what was happening with the Chicanos. But over time, he was being radicalized. When he was seeing all of these abuses taking place, he was radicalized in the process, but not to the degree, like I said, he took to the streets and he took on arms or he joined his militant group. No, he didn't do any of that. He was a reporter. But because he was speaking and defending the Mexican American at the time and letting non-Latinos or white people understand what the plight of Mexican Americans is in a language that they could understand, the police found him to be a threat, and the FBI found him to be a threat with Hoover. They had files on him. So in one of his essays, he talked about what is a Chicano. So a Chicano is a Mexican American with a non-Anglo image of himself. In this case, herself as well, but this is something that is important to understand. So la lucha sigue. It's not just the moratorium of 1970, but even to the present, there's still activists on the streets fighting every day in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, or professors like myself that have one foot in the community and one foot in the academy, where this past August 29th, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the National Chicano Moratorium. Here's some photos from the source, the Centro CSO. It's a community-based organization in East LA. They fight against police abuse and the wars in Iraq and ongoing wars in Afghanistan, and fight against Trump and other type of oppressors or dehumanizers against our people. So you see, there was hundreds, if not thousands of people. It wasn't 20, 30,000, but I'm sure there was a few thousand people protesting. There was two protesters. One that was on foot, and then the other one was a caravan. I was in the caravan. Here's a beautiful paintings. No, I'm sorry. Beautiful photos by Adrian Alvarez. He is an organizer, an activist, community activist. Full disclosure, Adrian and I were at UCLA at the same time in the 1980s and mid 80s, where we were organizing against U.S. intervention in Central America. We were arguing for divestment in South Africa, where it had a racist regime and apartheid. We were arguing and protesting to free Nelson Mandela. And later we were organizing gardeners. The city of LA wanted to ban leaf blowers and send gardeners to jail, 6 months in jail, $1,000 fine, and a misdemeanor charge. And later I organized in Southeast LA, in Southgate, where I protested against the power plant in Southgate, where we won. With people, Chicanos and Chicanas, activists like Adrian and others, these efforts are collective. They're not individual in terms of winning and humanizing, in this case, the Mexican, the Chicano, the Chicana, and showing them in the positive light, in the strong light, as fighters, as people that believe in brown power, brown pride, just like Black people 50 years ago said, Black power, Black is beautiful. So this is the same sentiment. When a people is oppressed, when a people is put down, there comes a time when they need to rise up, when they need to defend themselves, and when they need to speak for themselves and not let others speak for them. This is a portrait of Rosalio Munoz. He's a Mexican-American, a Chicano activist, longtime activist. Actually, he goes way back to the late 60s, 1970s. He was at UCLA, one of the few Chicanos on campus. I mean, probably you could just count them in one hand how many Chicanos were on campus back then. And he was one of the leaders of the Chicano Moratorium. So here he is. He's still, the portrait on the left, that's him. But here he is 50 years later. I think he's around 72. He's still protesting and still fighting. Here's another image. There's just different groups involved. In this case, it was Unión del Barrio. So I love the colors and the image and the art, and also the militancy, like, not backing down and defending themselves and speaking for themselves and self-determination. So actually, my wife and I attended. We drove. So she took some pictures. Actually, I had a nicer camera, but I didn't charge it, so I don't know what happened to me there. Probably old age is kicking in. I didn't charge the camera, so she used her iPhone, and she got these beautiful pictures as well. In this case, there was a lot of lowriders. I'm a fan of lowriders. And then you see here an elderly woman, talking about education and defending education. La educación se defiende no se vende. So the education should be defended. Don't sell out. So this is another photo that Antonia took. Um, the good day to be a Chicano. Literally, the caravan took about 4 hours, so there was a lot of cars, um, and there was some traffic, but overall it was pretty high participation. So there was one. There's one. It's another Chicano activist. Back in the day, he passed away now. His name's Sal Castro. In the 1960s, he led the walkouts at Lincoln High School, a school that I attended in the 80s. And he always used to say, it's a good day to be a Chicano. So participating in this protest, even though my camera didn't work, I didn't charge the battery. The cell phone worked, so that was good. Got this good picture, and I felt like now I know 50 years later that what Sal Castro meant about it was a good day to be a Chicano, because it felt good to be at a place where everybody looks like you, and even if there's white people, black people, Asians there, they think like you. In other words, they believe in the same thing that you believe, which makes me happy. This is what I say about people with Black Lives Matter. You don't have to be black to support Black Lives Matter. When they killed Mr. George Floyd, I was happy to see that black people, white people, Asians, Native Americans, and Chicanas were protesting and demanding justice for Mr. Floyd and all the other unarmed African Americans being killed, men, women, trans, and so on and so forth. So from my perspective, given that I've been organizing for the last 35 years, I feel and I believe in what Justice Sonia Sotomayor once said about the wise Latina. Actually, Sonia Sotomayor, she also grew up in the projects like I did, but she's from the Bronx or from New York. And she gave this talk about the wise Latina, and I believe in what she said. And for us, I think in terms of the movement, moving forward, our leaders are not the men, are not people like myself. Is more the women, like my mother who passed away, and my wife who's a teacher, and her colleagues, and the young Chicanas and Chicanos, the young Chicanas and Latinas at the university who fight for human rights and for dignity for all people, not just for brown people, but for all people. So what is to be done? A lot of times people ask me, okay, after you said everything you said in such an eloquent way, what should we do? I believe that we need to be bold, we need to be fearless, and we need to be uncompromising when it comes to the racialized, when it comes to people that have been pejoritized, Black people, brown people, Native Americans, Asians, and so on and so forth. Jewish people that have, with anti-Semitism on the rise, with white nationalism. I believe that whatever privilege you have, and sometimes students don't feel that they have privilege because they're poor. Like when I was at UCLA, I didn't have any money. I was on welfare at the time. I did get a lot of financial aid, I'm not gonna lie, but they don't offer financial aid like they did back then. But utilize your privilege. If you're a citizen, speak up. I'm a citizen, I was born here. So I say, and whatever comes to my mind, and I don't compromise. And the worst thing that can Trump do to me, because I defend DACA, I defend the undocumented, is he can deport me back to East LA. That's the worst thing he can do. If you have an education, use that education for the poor, for the marginalized. And I'm also talking about poor whites. If you look at Appalachia, if you look at in Riverside, anywhere where white folk are being oppressed, and they're being convinced that the brown man and the brown woman are taking their jobs. So we need to look out for them too and educate them and say, you're being oppressed by the same system, American capitalism that doesn't value labor and doesn't value humanity. If you speak English, you can speak up on behalf of the undocumented, Spanish-speaking immigrants, Filipino immigrants, Thai immigrants. Uh, and I'm sure there's many of you here on this talk uh, as participants. I'm sure many of you, you were 10 years old, you were translating for your mom and dad, you know, at the hospital, at the dentist, at the bank. You know, I was one of those, you know, and so I was surprised that they were having me translate where I wasn't good in English or Spanish. So I don't even know. I think most of the time I gave wrong information. But if you speak the language, you know, speak up on behalf of those that are marginalized. You know, protest against injustices, against ICE raids, kids in cages, brown kids in cages in particular. I'm sure there's no white kids in cages in Canada or in the border of Canada, Northern America. So let's protest that. We cannot sleep comfortably when we know that there's brown kids, babies being separated from their parents, contracting COVID, and experiencing emotional distress due to that separation. Protest against the wall. We need to imagine a world without borders. Speak out and take action against systemic racism on your campus, at home, in your neighborhood, in your community. And vote. Vote. Vote in November in defense of democracy and racial justice. You need to vote. You need to vote and get away from these policies that put kids in cages, that diminish uh, the hazard of COVID and undermining and causing, you know, almost 200,000 people dying or dead of COVID, given the neglect of the ruling class of today. The most important thing you could do, really, apart from everything I said, is buy my book. Once you buy Dr. Huerta's book, you're going to see enlightenment. You're going to go from darkness to lightness. This is like Siddhartha. You're going to see the light. So this is what I recommend. Only $19.99 at an Amazon near you. Or if you're against Amazon like my son, Joaquin Montes Huerta, then you could just buy it from the publisher. Just Google it and you'll find it, or you can email me. With that, muchas gracias. And rest in peace, my brother. So I'm going to turn it over to questions, comments. I can see there's a lot of you here, but I want to make sure we get questions. Do people have questions on the, people can do questions on the chat. So there's some great questions here. You know, some people are saying, "Oh, you're such a good-looking guy. How did you do it?" You know, I'm just kidding. About surviving the streets with gangs, and you know, the idea of respect. That's very important, which it is. Um, I never disrespect, even if I disagree with the homegirl. I never disrespect them because the consequences are great. So this is something that you learn. That's why I was funny. I've been funny all my life. Because since I was skinny, you know, like I would make the homeboys laugh, and so they wouldn't mess with me. We do see in the courts, in the prisons. I want to see more people ask questions, especially if you're in my class. Um, we do see in the prisons, the United States leads the world in incarceration. So there's about 2 million Americans that are in prison. The majority of them are black and brown, uh, and white, working class, white poor, but the majority black and brown. In California, the majority are Mexican American, and you see there's issues of, even within the prisons, there's gangs, and there's some serious issues there as well. But I think the biggest issue is just the incarceration and the criminalization of black and brown people. So this is something that I think is important. We have about 86 participants, so I need more questions because I get paid for every question. I get $1 for a question. My brother, yeah, he knows Frank Romero and Willie Giron. So if people just Google Salomon Huerta, don't do it now because you're going to take attention away from me. And he always try to take all the attention. If you just Google or just Google images, the art world is a small world, especially for Chicanos or Mexican Americans. In the case of my brother, he's actually a Mexican. He was born in Tijuana, and he came here when he was 6. I spent 4 years in Tijuana, so I was 4. So he's a real Mexican, unlike me. And but they all know each other, and they have like a lot of respect for each other. Obviously, in the art world, like in the academy, you have people who are jealous, or they have like petty stuff going on. But he's very positive, and he's been very good in advocating and pushing for artists to pursue graduate school and to go beyond their comfort zone. So if you want to be a good artist, just be who you are. If you want to be a great artist, then you need to, apply to a graduate school in New York. If you're from LA, like really go beyond that. So that's kind of like the difference in terms of from being good to great, to making that jump. In terms of advice for graduate, I feel and I believe that anybody needs to see themselves as their potential, and not see themselves as where they're at. In other words, a lot of times people like when I was growing up, I felt like, well, I'm from the projects. I can't go to UCLA. UCLA is for smart people. But it took somebody else that told me, my counselor, Miss Nicholson, and then a outreach person from UCLA who said, "Oh, you can go too. You can apply as well." So sometimes we need someone else to tell us that you can do it too. So the advice I have for people is apply. Go if you're at the university, that's fantastic. Graduate. That's the cake. Graduating is a cake, especially if you're first generation. Thereafter, graduate school is like icing on the cake. But don't limit yourself. Don't feel like, oh, I'm not good enough to go to Harvard or UCLA or UC Berkeley, or even a graduate school at Cal Poly Pomona, or wherever they have graduate programs. Do well in school, get good grades. If you have to take the LSAT or the GRE, you have to invest, pay, to take these prep courses to prepare you. So those are some of the things that I recommend. And then people can also email me, and I can give more specific advice. I do see that once Trump was elected, the Mexicans have been targeted more, and it's strategic. America always needs a scapegoat. When the Japanese were put in camps by a Democrat president, in this case FDR or Roosevelt, he didn't put the Germans in camps. And Germany was a bigger threat back then compared to Japan in terms of Nazism and the threat against Europe and the world. I mean, they easily could have taken over the world if they would have prevailed in World War II. Fortunately, the Russians, were very instrumental in defeating the Germans in key battles. But the leader sets the course. The leader in any community, any campus sets the course. At Cal Poly Pomona, we have a great leader, African American woman, Dr. Coley. And whenever there's violence or immigrants are being deported, she speaks out. She makes a public statement, and that's not acceptable. That's not who we are. So fortunately, in our campus is, it's great in the areas of diversity. Obviously, there's going to be issues. I experienced microaggression by someone at my campus, but he didn't go to Berkeley, so that's this inferiority complex. So the idea here is, for us to unite and organize, not based on the color of our skin, but like the color of our consciousness. If something is wrong, is wrong. In terms of anti-Semitism amongst BLM movement, that I'll be honest, I'm not sure. I'm not really privy to that. I'm someone who's in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, but I'm not like a leader in the movement. I'm not part of the movement. And I believe what they do is just like what the Black Panthers did. Within the movement themselves, it's only Black people that are part of it in terms of the leadership. And that's something I actually believe, because people have to fight for their own interests. But in terms of anti-Semitism, I honestly, I'm not being a politician, but I'm not aware of that either way. But overall, I'm against anti-Semitism. I think the biggest threat against Jewish people today in the United States is white nationalism. When Trump said that there's good people on both sides, and those white nationalists were saying derogatory terms, not only towards black, but towards Jewish people. They had the swastika. I found that horrific. My son went to schools with, most of his friends were Jewish. I went to a few bar mitzvahs. So I'm very supportive of any people, and unless you're a Nazi or neo-Nazi, that's, then stay away from me, or a Trump supporter. But I think that we all need to be aware of any type of discrimination against any people based on race, religion, the color of their skin, or sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. I think a lot of times with gangs, it's a tricky situation. A lot of times gangs do arise from a self-defense, and then they take on a role where they become predators themselves. So I'm not someone who romanticizes gangs. I'm not someone who does that. But because I grew up in an environment where the majority of my friends were in gangs, the majority of my friends died, the majority of my friends went to jail. I have family members who were in gangs. I could see why. I could see why they joined, and the cycle that they're involved in. And I think it goes back to America, and how the leaders have set this precedent of being in constant war, in constant warfare with Mexico. The United States has invaded all Latin American countries, um, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan. So we see a lot of this going on. So I see gangs as people who take on that role, who parrot that gang, that violence mentality. And this is something that we need to break away from. We need to fight violence against each other, and violence against marginalized people at all levels, which is totally unacceptable, even in the case with domestic violence. And all these things actually I'm too, unfortunately, too familiar with. There is a big issue in our communities with the case of, I'm not assuming that everybody's Mexican. There's some of you might be Central American or Latin American, or some of you are non-Latino or Latina, and I understand that. But in the case of Mexican Americans, there is this case of colorism, and that I would attribute it back to the Spaniards. When they first arrived and they conquered Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, um, and killed Cuauhtemoc. Um, they established a system based on color, where the Europeans, in this case the Spaniard, only married among each other, and if you were white, you were at the top. If you were married with an indigenous, you were below that. If you were indigenous, you were at the bottom. If there was a case of later of the case of Africans coming to Mexico, then there's this hierarchy, they were at the bottom as well. So you do see this anti-Black sentiment, anti-indigenous within Mexican society, within Latin America. That is true and that is real. You see, for example, when you watch novelas, Los ricos lloran también, not that I've ever watched it, but I know their name, is that they're all beautiful, blonde, skinny, and they're the leading roles. And in the case of indigenous, they're the servants. They don't even speak the language. They're caricatures. So you see the way indigenous are being treated in Mexico is the same way that the African Americans are being treated in the United States. So this is something that we need to fight against in our own communities, in terms of anti-Blackness, anti-indigenous. And we need to make the point that in terms of Black and brown and others, we have more in common than we So there's no reason why we should be fighting each other. That only benefits the system and the status quo. And you also see where the dominant culture, the leaders have been very effective in in brainwashing many African Americans that Mexicans are taking their jobs, and if they're poor and if they don't have jobs, it's because of the Mexican. This is what I mean about being careful with this divide and conquer. So you see, while you do see anti-blackness in Mexican American communities, you see anti-immigrant sentiments within Black communities as well. So I want to be clear, I want to be fair, and I want to be honest here. On both cases, it's true. It exists. What they don't understand, what both groups don't understand, is that by falling into that narrative, we're falling into a trap where we end up fighting each other. It's like the Crips and the Bloods. You know, we fight for a block that we don't even own. You know, we're dying and we're going to jail for and killing each other instead of fighting against the system that oppresses all people, not just the United States, but throughout the world, or demanding justice, or demanding that police, you know, disarm and stop choking people and stop gagging them and stop shooting them without cause. In terms of Latino supporters for Trump, I mean, I'm arguing with this guy right now online. I don't know why I even respond to the dude. And he was like, "Oh, Latinos support Trump by 40%." No, that's not true. They're about 25%. That when Trump beat Hillary with the help of Russia and WikiLeaks and Comey, 25% people voted for 25% of Latinos voted for Trump. A lot of them are conservative. A lot of them are Cuban Americans, like anti-Cuba, anti-Castro. So so in Florida they get a lot of that vote. And then there's a lot of Mexican Americans or Mexicans that are very conservative. They're very religious. So if Trump is anti-abortion, and these individuals are also anti-abortion because of religion, then they're going to support Trump. So I think you see a lot of that. But if you're Mexican or if you're Latino, Latina supporting Trump, it's a case of self-hate. You don't see how can you support somebody who calls your people criminals and murderers and rapists? You know, to me that makes no sense. But we have to see about interest as well. So what are their interests? And okay, we have 10 more minutes. Every time I get a question, I get a free taco. So because I write for LA Taco. I think in terms of how we, like, for those of us who are minorities or minoritized, you know, how can we change the narrative is we need to go to the university and we need to take on positions of power. We need to write books. We need to write articles. We need to change the narrative in terms of what the story is. And at the end of the day, it's not about stats, or anything like that. It's about telling stories. It's about humanizing the Mexican. It's about humanizing the Central American. And in reality, I don't even want to call, you know, my people immigrants, because we've been here for forever. You know, I see America not as the United States. I see America as a continent. And we need to, I don't even want to use the term immigrant. It's more like people on the move, because everybody has immigrated at one point or another. You know, the late 1800s to the early 1900s, 20 million immigrants came from Europe, including, you know, Trump's grandparents. So those people are here today. Their children are here today. So where do we do the cutoff? You know, where do we cut it off? So everybody comes from somewhere. At the end of the day, we all come from Africa, so we're all Africans. And if you go back millions of years, so we have to be careful and get away from this us versus them narrative. And one of the ways to do it is to do well, you know, be good at what you do, and showcase, you know, to the world through photography, through art, through books, through articles, you know, the positive lights of communities. Usually when I present, I don't get too much into, oh, this Latino politician is corrupt, or you know, Mexicans are raping this or that. I mean, these things do happen in all groups. You see this in the White House. Every other person has been convicted of a crime. But at the end of the day, the majority of people, that come to this country, unless you're a neo-Nazi, come here to make a better life for themselves, for their families, and not just here, but they send money home. So these are the people that we need to embrace. I need to see more comments. I know like 20 people left, so I'm gonna have to give them fails. More comments, please. I don't know why I'm saying please. It's like you're doing me a favor. Yeah, so with gangs, like I said, it's tricky. But for me, my focus is not necessarily the gangs on the streets, but I see the LAPD, NYPD as their gangs themselves. They're organized. They have weapons. They collude. They cover each other. So I think that that's something that we need to be more concerned about in terms of gangs and the military, behaving like gangsters and invading other countries and overthrowing democratically elected presidents, like the case of Arbenz in Guatemala in 54, I think, in Chile in 70, 72 with Allende, and then also in Iran around the same in the early 50s, the United States overthrew the democratically elected president. So the real gangsters are the ones in government, the ones with guns, the ones with power, and those are the ones that are dictating the policy today. Those are the ones that are causing the massive death in COVID because we don't have a federal policy. Because people are now encouraged to wear masks. People, there's no universal health care where people are protected. Any other questions, preguntas? It could be in Spanish, English, Spanglish. Nobody else, y'all? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. This is what happens when you drink and you Zoom. Okay, somebody's asking about the leaf blower and the recommendations against environmental regulations. That's a. I mean, I'm in an environment. I believe in the environment. I'm an environmentalist. And the thing with the leaf blowers, gardeners and myself included, we are against the leaf blowers themselves because they use gasoline or they're gas powered. But what we wanted was environmental solution. So can we have a leaf blower that is environmentally friendly, for example, that is driven by batteries or other means where it's not polluting. So if anybody's going to go to jail, it should be the manufacturers. They shouldn't punish the actual users. But I do believe in public transportation to reduce the amount of pollution, whether it's bicycles or whether it's public transportation, or if you have like in the Bay Area, where you have these trains that are BART that are pretty good. So those type of issues I believe in. So currently I have two books. I have the one book that is out, and then another one that was in 2003. One of them was with Antonio Turok. He's a Mexican photographer. Actually, speaking of Semitism, his family is Jewish. In the 1950s, they left the United States due to the Red Scare, and they settled in Mexico City. So he grew up Mexican, even though he's American, he's white. But he's actually more Mexican than I am because he can speak the language and he can drink more tequila than I can. But he's, friend of the family. He's one of ours in that sense. But I did a book with him. I'm working on a new one, similar like essays that I'm writing on different topics related to police abuse, to immigration, to how to win the elections against Trump, how to educate Democrats and getting the Latino vote out because they're doing a terrible job. And then the last one on Mexican immigrants and their social networks and the informal economy. So that one should be out soon. In terms of defunding the police, I think that I'm in support of that. I think the language is a little tricky because it's very ambiguous. Sometimes people will take it in different ways. So what does that mean? Does that mean abolish police? Does that mean cut the budgets and things of that nature? So it gets a little tricky. In my position is very clear. I don't think, like in the city of LA, the police take up like 50% of the budget. I don't think that they should take up 50% of the budget just to beat black and brown people. And actually more Latinos are killed by the police in LA than blacks, because there's more of us. So I think the relationship between the police and the communities of color is more of an occupation force versus to protect and to serve. So as far as I'm concerned, if their budget goes from 10 billion or whatever it is to zero, then so be it. I mean, what good is it that they're doing for our communities? Now, there has to be other ways so we need to imagine communities and societies, and imagine societies without prisons, without police, and without borders. So for me, it's being critical and questioning and not accepting the status quo as is. Unfortunately, what happens is that you have a lot of police that lie and fabricate the numbers just so that they can their budget. So I see a lot of that going on as well. Okay, so I see the chat también. I was only answering the Q&A, but not the chat. Yeah, there's a lot of people saying, "Oh, you're so good looking. How do you do it?" It's kind of hard being good looking because people don't respect my ideas. They keep looking at me. So I want to just tell people that, please respect my ideas. Yeah, there's a big issue. There's a big issue with having right-wing militias. Those are the real threat, really, because they're armed and a lot of them are ex-military. So we need to be very careful with that. Most of the protesters that I see with Black Lives Matter, they're black people, they're white people, they're brown people, they're Asians and Native Americans. They're all peaceful. You do see incidents of violence. Violence against property is not violence, that's property damage, so let's be clear about that. But you also see, in what is not being reported, there should, and what people need to understand, that there's agent provocateurs, that there's people within the state, within the police, within the FBI, that they infiltrate these groups and they support inciting violence. So that happens with the Black Panthers, that happens with Brown Berets, and that's happening now to kill the movement. I think in terms of, I'm going to end with this. I think with lately, because I know we're supposed to end at 2:15. So in the case of Cal Poly Pomona or higher education or any university, I strongly believe in ethnic studies and something that should be fought for and abandoned. And you don't have to be black and brown to have black and brown curricula. I mean, I'm not black, and I want to learn more about the case of African Americans in this country. I'm not Asian, but I want to learn more about Asian Americans in this country. So it only makes us better. Americans have to get away from this English only, or we only know and learn European history, or the interpretation of black and brown people through the European gaze. So we need to move beyond that and embrace our diversity, embrace our humanity. And at the end of the day, like I said, we're all human beings first. Race is a social construct, and we all have more in common than we have in different. Unless you're orange, that's different, because they're a special breed. But overall, I love all people, and I'm more concerned with building coalitions and solidarity with like-minded people that believe in justice and dignity and respect for all people. So with that, muchas gracias. I appreciate everybody that joined. The 20 people that left early, I'm gonna have to look for them and fill them, which is okay with me, because in Rate My Professor, it looks like I'm giving everybody an A, so I have to work on that. So I love being here at Cal Poly Pomona, and thank you, Chris, for organizing this, and all of you for for listening to me, and for taking time in your day to look at life from a different perspective, from a perspective from someone who typically will not be found at great universities, like Cal Poly Pomona, like UCLA, UC Berkeley, because of where I started and where I came from. So I just want to end with that. If a kid from the projects, if a kid whose parents were illiterate can make it, so can you. And don't let anybody make you feel otherwise. Don't let anybody make you feel like you're less than. All of you are smart. All of you are beautiful, and believe in yourselves. And you should not be validated by anybody but yourselves. So with that, muchas gracias. And we'll see you all soon. And buy my book.